everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for journeying out to Oakland, Chinatown, to the Oakland Asian Cultural Center. We don't quite have a full house, but you know what? Y'all made it on time, and we want to respect everyone's time. So we will go ahead and get started, and then we will welcome in audience members as they trickle in and find us. But in the meantime, I wanted to just open up with some brief remarks. So again, welcome to the Oakland Asian Cultural Center. If it's your first time here, thank you so much for finding us and finding our program today. My name is Akemi Chan Imai, and I am the program manager at OACC. OACC's mission is to build vibrant communities through API arts and cultural programs that foster intergenerational and cross-cultural dialogue, understanding, collaboration, and social justice. And it is our great pleasure and honor to present today's event in partnership with East Wind Books of Berkeley. They are amazing partners for us for so long. They're supervising the book sales table outdoors, and they're just a wonderful team. So please, if you can support them, that would be amazing. So before I go any further in the program, I did want to share a land acknowledgement. Because OACC is physically based in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we would like to acknowledge the legacy and presence of the indigenous peoples who have and continue to steward this land. And this land acknowledgement I'm about to share was provided by Canyon Sayers Roots. She is a member of the Costanoan, Ohlone, and Chumash people. And she and her mother, tribal chairwoman Anne-Marie Sayers, are involved in the preservation of Indian Canyon, providing it as a space for all indigenous peoples in need of land for ceremony. We are in Huichin. The first language spoken on these lands is Chochenyo. We are gathered on the traditional lands of those whom we know today as the Ohlone people. Ohlone territory spans from San Francisco east towards Oakland and south towards Monterey. 8 language dialects exist within this territory, and historically there are over 60 village sites. It is important that we recognize the original stewards of the territory. We pay our respect to elders both past and present. We acknowledge that not only are we on their lands, but that they are still here and part of the community. There are 3 active community groups that have indigenous ancestry to this territory, and they are the Confederated Villages of Lishan, Himmaran of Ohlone, Bay Miwok and Plains Miwok, and Muwekma tribe. Thank you very much. And now I would like to, just some brief housekeeping notes. If in the event of an emergency, there are 2 exits to your back, and you can very clearly find our exit from there. If you need the restrooms, please exit from the back and loop around to your left. There's a nice hallway with nice art. And now, I think that concludes my housekeeping, so I would love to hand it over to one of OACC's board members, Daren Murata. Daren.
Hello, my name is Daren. I'm an OACC board member, and I've been an avid comic collector since I could read. So it is my great pleasure to be involved in this panel. I also run a crappy YouTube channel called 4Color Films, where I unbox CGC comics. Everybody has to have a COVID hobby, so that's mine. But it is my pleasure to introduce Pornsak Pichetshote and Jean Luen Yang. Pornsak used to be an editor at DC's Vertigo imprint for many years, working on such greats as Sandman, Swamp Thing, and Sweet Tooth, which we probably all know. And since then has moved on to writing, and kicked it off with a really scary book called Infidel, which if you haven't read, you should. You kept me up for 2 nights, but that's fine. That's okay. I don't blame you, buddy. That's fine. And then most recently has been kicking it with the book Good Asian, which is a noir piece with an Asian lead. Fantastic. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Jean Luen Yang has been around for a while and been a talented writer in this marketplace for a long time. He's an artist and a teacher, as well as a writer. Harvey Award winner and a MacArthur Fellow. among many other awards. He is known for Boxers and Saints, Avatar, Shang-Chi, and Superman Smashes the Klan, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. And most recently, American-Born Chinese has been picked up by Disney Plus to be a series directed by none other than,
Thank you.
directed by none other than Daniel Cretton, who directed Shang-Chi, which if you haven't seen that movie, go see it. But if you've seen it, I know you loved it, because I did. It's fantastic. And I personally can't think of a better director for that book, so congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming, everyone.
Any opening remarks from you two gents?
Yeah, well, I guess first of all, just thank you for coming. It's I was telling these guys, the book has been serialized for, it's coming out for the past 4 or 5 months now, but I didn't really realize I actually hadn't seen people who read the book in public until recently doing signings for the book. So it's amazing to just see human beings who've read the book, so thank you for coming. Yeah, and I guess, should I just roll into sort of talking about the book and all that? Yeah, so in case you're not aware of it, The Good Asian, I kind of call it Chinatown Noir. It's a 1936 detective story in the style of Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe, featuring the first generation of immigrants, first generation of Americans who grew up underneath an immigration ban, the Chinese. And it's about Edison Hark, who is one of America's first Chinese-American detectives. And it's very much inspired by the life, of Changaparna, who was the inspiration for Charlie Chan. Who was the first Chinese-American detective. And the thing I find fascinating about him is that that was the early 20th century. If you were, for a cop in Chinatown, they didn't need you to write tickets. They needed you to go into Chinese opium and gambling dens and come back out and tell the cops who the troublemakers were and where to raid. For all intents and he was in a way an undercover cop, and by many definitions of it, you could consider him a race traitor because he was being used against sort of other Chinese people. Changaparna at the time, this is not Edison Hark, but Changaparna at the time was called upon to catch lepers who and help send them to Molokai. And at the time, leprosy in Hawaii was considered a Chinese disease, so he was rounding up Chinese people and to send them off the island. But so he was the inspiration for Edison Hark, and I wanted to do a Chinese American detective who really acknowledges the history of Asian Americans at the time. And for me, anyway, so my parents always used to argue, whenever they used to argue about politics. This was living in Thailand. I spent about 5 years in Thailand. Whenever my mom and dad would argue about politics, whenever my dad was losing, he would always conclude the argument by saying like, "Oh, that's a problem with you. It's because you're Thai. That's why you think that way." And my mom would be like, "You're Thai too. Like, don't give me that crap." And he's like, "No, I'm Chinese." And she'd be like, "You don't speak Chinese. You've never been to China. Like, you're Thai. Just like chill with the Chinese thing." And so in my dad's later years, he got really obsessed about his Chinese roots. And so anytime I would go back home, he'd talk about China this, China that. He'd watch a lot of documentaries about Chinese dams. I still don't understand why. And when he passed, like part of me sort of processing that loss was to learn more about this thing that he was so obsessed by. And the thing I find very, very interesting is that for me personally, the narcissistic, obsessive person that I am, the thing I find really interesting is that I think typically in that scenario, someone would have been very interested in Chinese history or Chinese mythology. And for whatever reason, and part of it might be my own pop culture, Americana-addled brain, I ended up drifting to discovering and reading up more about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which would lead to me just to discover the Immigration Act of 1924, which banned Asians and Arabs coming into the country. And I spent 5 years in high school growing up in Thailand. So I didn't know anything about either of those acts. And I was kind of shocked as sort of an Asian American man growing up, not being aware of any of that. And ashamed too. And I was also curious, again, with this sort of pop culture addled mind that I had, I was fascinated by the fact that in the 1930s, characters like Charlie Chan were enormously popular. So much so they spawned Mr. Moto and Mr. Wong Detective. And there was this entire subgenre of Asian crime solvers, even though Asians couldn't actually enter the country. And I found that so jarring and so interesting that that would end up sort of factoring a lot of wanting to do the good Asian, is to do an Asian crime solver in the tradition of, of those characters, but to factor in all the actual Asian history, Asian American history that was happening at the time. So for the good Asian, it's very much starts off as your classic noir. A detective comes to town looking for a missing girl, discovers murder, discovers conspiracy, but it's a way. But he winds up in 1936 Chinatown in San Francisco that he's never been to before. It explores that community at the time. It explores a community that came of age in 1936 in the shadow of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that's the only thing that they've known. The only thing the people at that time knew was that immigration ban. And so I was really interested in exploring what that does to a people and what that does to a sense of identity and what that does to a sense of community. And at the time, there's not a ton of research about that. So writing the book meant doing a lot of research, compositing a lot of different texts about what it was like in the 1930s in general, what it was like for 1930s for Chinese Americans, what the Exclusion Act was like, and kind of tetrising all this research together and kind of trying to fashion this sort of noir thriller that explores some of this history a little bit, and doing it in a way that it gave me a chance to scratch a lot of itches that I had. I'm a huge fan of Shang-Chi. I'm a huge fan of so much martial arts stuff. But one of the things that I wished I had was I liked the idea of an Asian protagonist that didn't know kung fu, that there was no mysticism, And so this kind of gave me the chance to do just that, to fashion a protagonist in sort of that mold. And the book it's been really interesting. The book has come out. It's had a nice response when it came out, as it's come out. But the thing I wasn't expecting, because I pitched the book in 2018, the book launched. We announced the book the third week of February, and that was, and I remember this distinctly. It was 2.5 weeks after the Lunar New Year, and there was a spike in Asian hate crimes, and the national news hadn't started covering it yet. And literally the week we announced the book, I think one national news place covered it. And so that started this whole conversation about Stop Asian Hate and all that stuff. And it became this very surreal, environment to talk about the book that I totally don't think I didn't know how to handle. I probably lost my mind for a couple of days about if I was handling it right. Because the book on the one hand was about that, but wasn't specifically about that, because how could it be? Because I wrote it 2 years before. But it was very much about the history that kind of led us and brought us to sort of that moment and talking about that. And so it's been interesting to sort of watch the stuff that we're talking about in the book have some contemporary relevance in a way. When I wrote the book, I thought the most relevant part of it would be the immigration ban aspect of it and what was happening with the Muslim ban. So the idea that it unfortunately became a really relevant book was kind of a surreal thing to sort of experience and sort of process.
Oh, sure.
And Gene, pass to you.
Well, I think the theme of this event is actually maybe Asian American stories from the 30s and 40s, and how that allows Asian American writers to kind of scratch itches. Because I feel like that's sort of one of the reasons why I did the books that I did. So I have 2 different books about Asian American characters in the 1940s and 30s. The first one that I want to talk about is Superman Smashes the Klan, which came out last year from DC Comics. And it's a book that I did with an art team named Guri Hiru. They're based in Japan. They are amazing, super prolific. When I first started working with them, I was sure they were 20 people, but they're really just 2.
Oh, wow.
It's Chifuyu Sasaki and Naoka Kawano. They're 2 best friends who, one of them does all of the pencils and the other one does all of the inks, and they are amazing. So we worked on Avatar: The Last Airbender comics together, and when DC approved this project, I was like, I want to work with them. And they fortunately said yes. Superman Smashes the Klan is actually a retelling of one of the most famous stories from the Superman mythos. So back in the 1940s, Superman had the most popular radio show in America. And all throughout World War II, he fought Nazis, one Nazi after the other. When the Nazis were defeated in real life, the writer's room was like, we can't have him keep fighting Nazis. We have to find some other villain for him to fight. So they had this discussion, who is the biggest threat to peace in post-war America? And nobody's sure whose idea this was. There was like this big debate about it that's still not settled to this day. But they somehow landed on the idea of having Superman go up against the Ku Klux Klan. They knew there were going to be all these dangers to that idea. They knew they were going to get some pushback. But they decided to do it anyways. And when they did get that hate that they were expecting. So there were communities in America that called for boycotts against the sponsors of that show. They got death threats from the New Jersey Klan. I didn't even know there was a New Jersey Klan, but I guess there was. But for the most part, it actually was a success. So the first episode debuted in June of 1946. It ran for 16 episodes. Across those 16 episodes, the listenership of that radio show actually grew. And by the end, the most important thing that happened was that the membership of the real-life Klan actually went down. So after getting called out by this guy in a red cape on a fictional children's radio show, people were so embarrassed by the KKK that they stopped joining. And for me as a geek, like just purely as a geek, I love that story. Because when I was a kid, my immigrant parents used to be like, why are you reading these comics? People do not actually fly in real life, right? And here was this thing that happened that points to the fact that even if you have a story about people who fly around in red capes, it can still have a profound effect on real life, right? A story isn't just about like the incidentals of the story. It's not just about the capes and not just about the superpower. It's also about the underlying message that it's saying about society. I first learned about this storyline several years ago in a book called Freakonomics. You know that book. It's a New York Times bestseller, right? And they devote a whole chapter on it. And when I looked into it, I realized that this book, even though it's considered one of the most important stories about Superman ever told, has never been told in comics. So a few years ago, at a meeting with Marie Javins, who's now the bigwig at DC Comics, legendary comic book editor, and I proposed this to them, and luckily she said yes. I feel the same way that Pornsak does, right? Like when this book came out in 2020, I wasn't expecting it to be as resonant as it was, and it's both like, I don't know, like I was happy to be a part of the conversation, right, but it's also really depressing, right? Like this is a story set in 1940, and it still resonates in 2020. It's like ridiculous. The other book that I want to talk about is The Shadow Hero, which I did in 2014 with a friend of mine named Sunny Liu. Sunny is a great writer and artist. He won a whole bunch of Eisner Awards, which is one of the big awards in the American comic book industry, for a book called Charlie Chan Hok Chai, where he tells the story of Singapore, the history of Singapore, in graphic novel format. It's amazing, an amazing book. In any case, The Shadow Hero is also about a character from the 1940s. So there's an actual character that is rumored to be the very first Asian American superhero. His name is the Green Turtle. He debuted in 1945 in a series called Blazing Comics. Very obscure character, very obscure comic. And he only lasted 5 issues. So he was not a great character. He was kind of like a Batman ripoff, right? Like he had a really goofy costume. He had a green cowl, he had a green cape, and he didn't wear a shirt. And he operated out of a turtle cave. He flew around in a turtle plane. Not an awesome character. But the thing that I found intriguing about him when I first read about him on the internet was that he was created by one of the first Asian Americans working in the American comic book industry, a guy named Chu Hing. And the rumor about Green Turtle was that Chu Hing wanted him to be a Chinese American, but his publishers wouldn't let him do it. So he reacts the way that most of us cartoonists react when we're faced with adversity. He got really passive aggressive, okay? And he draws these early Green Turtle comics so that you almost never see the character's face, right? He almost always has his back facing you, so all you can see is his cape. And then when he is turned around, either his face is covered in shadow, or he's punching, and he always punches like this, or there's like a piece of furniture right there. And the rumor was that Chu Hing did this so that both he and his reader could imagine his character as an Asian American with an Asian face, right? Nobody knows if the rumor is true, but it was so intriguing to me. I looked up, I found those early, Green Turtle comics in the Blazing Comics anthology. I read them, and Chu Hing never gets around to telling us his secret origin or his secret identity. So we have no idea if he actually is an Asian American. And I saw this as a hole that we could fill. So I asked Sunny Liu to work with me on this, and we created a secret origin for this obscure character from the 1940s. And we established him firmly as an Asian American. I was thinking about, when I first read about the Green Turtle and why I was so, I stayed up nights thinking about this guy with no shirt and a green cowl, right? And I think it's because of this. I think, as Asian Americans, we struggle with this perception of perpetual foreignness. It doesn't matter if we were born here, it doesn't matter how long our family's been here. There are certain segments of American society that will always see us as foreign. And for me, superheroes are like a deeply American genre. They were born in America, they kind of came of age as America was asserting itself as a superpower on the world stage. I think there's just something fundamentally American about superheroes. So to find out there was this character who dates back to the very, very early days of American superheroes, right? 1945, that's less than a decade after Superman was created. It just felt like comic book history was telling me, people like you have always been here, even if you've had to hide your face. There's just something deeply affirming about the fact that the Green Turtle even existed.
That is a great story, for sure. Thank you for that. So, with that, we'll start the questions. And my first question to you, to both of you, is what is it about the comics medium that excites you?
Do you want to go first? Oh, okay. I love comics. The first thing, if I'm going to think about what excites me about comics is, the thing that doesn't excite me about comics is there isn't a ton of money in comics. But part of there not being a ton of money in comics means that people are very much in it for the love of the medium. And hardly surprising that when you find people are doing it for the love of the work, you find lovely people. And so they're just lovely people working in comics. And it's such a collaborative medium. I don't have a lick of musical talent in me, but working on a comic, it feels like what it would be like if I was in a band. There is a give and a take, there's a communication that sort of happens. And I know Gene is like this with his books too. You get to know your collaborators, and there is sort of a sense of family and camaraderie. There's definitely a assembly line method of working in comics, but I've had the luxury of not working in that way, and so I'm very, my artist Alexander Tefengji for The Good Asian, even though he lives in France, we talk every 2 or 3 weeks just to sort of catch up about life. My colorist, Lee Lowridge, he was the first person I got drinks with when I started in comics. Jeff Powell, we've worked on 2 books together now. I'm friends with him and his wife. Will Dennis, my editor, he's one of my best friends in comics. So it's very much a sort of a family sort of feel. It's very intimate, and that's one of the main reasons why I love comics so much. And I think too, because there isn't a ton of money in there, there's so much experimentation, and it is such a novel. It is no surprise to me why film and TV keeps optioning sort of comics, because it is a medium that seems to prioritize not just imagination but conceptual thinking, and it's as a result I just love the medium so much, and in many ways it's the girl who brought me to the dance, and I'll be I'll stay by her for the entire duration.
Do you remember when you bought your first comic?
Oh yeah. Well, my first comic was Amazing Spider-Man number 230, which was the second half of Nothing. No One Can Stop the Juggernaut. And my first, that would lead me to the first comic I would collect on a regular basis, being Marvel Tales written by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. And the thing that I find fascinating about that is that, and I'll give this question to you next, but the thing I find fascinating about that is that those themes, being an outsider, coming of age, I can see that in all of my work, and I found that that's the case for a lot of creators I know. So I'm like curious, like, what was your first comic? But do you remember the first comic you like followed? And can you see the thematic
I mean,
ties?
that's sort of the classic comic book geek thing.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
remember the title and the issue number.
Right.
And for me, it was DC Comics Presents number 87.
Okay.
Starring Superman and the Atomic Knights.
Nice.
But I was
Nice.
a big Marvel guy.
Okay.
I was definitely much more of a Marvel guy. So
Nice.
even though my first comic was a DC comic, I very quickly fell into the Marvel universe.
Do you remember the first comic you like collected? Like you try to fill runs?
So
and
it
all
was
that?
hard for me to collect because my mom would not take me to
Right.
the comic book shop regularly.
Yeah.
Right? I would have to beg and beg and beg, and maybe I'd get there every 6 months.
Okay,
in
okay.
the beginning, and eventually, I had a friend named Jeremy Kunioshi who was a comic book geek, and he was like, I got a trick for you. Get your mom to drop you off at the library, and then walk to the comic book
Nice.
shop. So that's what we did.
Nice.
So
Cool, that's a good
after
trick.
that, I don't know. I had a small run of Fantastic Four.
Okay.
And, yeah.
Okay.
I had a hard time regularly collecting comics until I got my driver's license.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, but I think it's the same thing. I think I do love the fact that there's not a lot of money in comics, especially when you compare it to other storytelling media.
Yeah.
It's a sucky thing,
Yeah.
but it does lend for like a small family feeling
Yeah.
to the industry, and it also lends for people to just pursue like these really crazy passions.
Yeah.
I think you can do things in the comic book medium that would be very difficult in something like television
Yeah.
or movies, right? In some ways, I feel like television movies these days are waiting for us to conduct the
Yeah.
experiment, and
Very
then when
much.
it's successful, they're like, oh,
Yeah.
let's do that.
Yeah, totally,
You know?
totally. We're this petri dish
Yeah, we're like
that
a
they look over
Yeah.
and want to see.
Which in some ways is good, but I also think that the danger of that is you think of comics as like the minor league.
Yeah.
Whereas I think comics are it.
Yeah,
Right.
100%.
It's the comic.
Yeah.
And then the movies and TV are just like icing, but the cake is comics.
Yes, 100%, 100%.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think all of that lends to like a very unique culture within the medium of comics.
Excellent. So let's talk a little bit about influences. You went there a little bit already, but I was just curious about what influenced you to become part of the comics medium directly? People, who were those people? And bonus question, were there any Asians in there?
Oh, that's interesting.
There's Larry Hama.
Yeah, there's not.
That's
read
mine
Larry
too.
Hama?
I mean, I read G.I. Joe not realizing that Larry Hama was Asian or who Larry Hama was, but I definitely read. And I feel like that was the first place where you saw an Asian influence at all with Snake
Yes.
Eyes and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's true. So Larry Hama is, I mean, at this point, he's a legendary comic book artist and writer. I think he's more well known for his writing.
Yeah,
Right?
at this point, yeah.
And Japanese American, and he had a huge influence on the G.I. Joe property. I remember being a kid and watching G.I. Joe on my television and thinking like, oh, that's it. Like, there are a lot of people of a lot of different skin colors on that show.
Yeah.
Compared to all of the other cartoons that were
It's
around,
kind of
right?
amazing. If you look at G.I. Joe now, how not just diverse but feminist it is. Like there's that very famous issue where it's all silent that Snake Eyes goes to rescue Scarlet, and it was written back in the 80s, but it's about a male character rescuing a female character, but even by like today's standards, like it still checks all the boxes where like they go in and she saves herself, but then she saves him and then he saves her and then you're not quite sure who saved who, and it's just in that entire book there were characters of all different ethnicities and all the female characters got a moment to shine, and it's kind of incredible. Like when talking about like the history of diversity in comics, like I do think it's overlooked because
It is.
it is so influential in that way.
Yeah. I think people overlook it because it's a comic based on a toy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But the fact that Larry Hama was able to put so much of his own heart and
Yeah.
his own concerns into that property is really amazing.
Yeah, definitely.
So Larry Hama, you have anyone else?
I mean, my influences in comics were, coming from Vertigo, it was, I feel it's the ones everyone sort of says. It's Alan Moore, it's Grant Morrison. I have a couple indie cartoonists. Chester Brown was a big influence on me. Joe Sacco is a huge influence on me just with his journalism comics and his particular way of making journalism so subjective. But Larry definitely, Larry was the first. Larry was the first, but honestly, Gene, like when American Born Chinese came out, I'd never seen anything like that before, and it was so exciting to me to see, like, you know, to see someone like dip into, because in a way it was a book that like I very much wanted to exist. I hadn't seen a graphic novel that acknowledged Asian American history, and so that is influenced me not an inconsiderable amount either.
Well, thanks. Thanks. I mean, I think I was influenced by all the folks you mentioned, but I also kind of came up in the industry with a group of Asian American cartoonists. We used to all hang out in the Bay Area. We would every Wednesday night we would get together at somebody's house, right? And we would have dinner together, and we'd look over each other's pages, and I do feel like those people, like that group of cartoonists, had a huge influence on me. So it was like Jason Shiga, who's still in Oakland. Derek Kirk Kim, who eventually went into animation. He worked on Adventure Time. And then he's back in comics now. He does a book called The Last Mermaid. I don't think it's released yet, but he's working on it. And Lark Pien, there's a guy named Jesse Ham who passed away recently. And I think coming up with them, learning to look at comics the way they did, learning to analyze the art form the way they did was super helpful to me.
That's super fascinating. That's awesome. All right, so both of you have a historical perspective in your books most recently, and so, you know, 1940s San Francisco, or 30s, 1940s Metropolis in some cases. So what made you decide to go back to that time period from an Asian perspective?
I think for me, it was, you know, I really wanted to talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act. I really wanted to tell a noir story. And so noir typically starts, you know, the classic era of noir is sort of the 1940s. But if you go back to sort of the paperback noir, that's sort of the 1930s stuff. So it was like, okay, we'll do gumshoe detective noir. I really wanted to sort of like twist that genre. And then I landed on 1936 specifically because you know, because of the Nanjing Massacre in 1937, I kind of realized that there was no way, everything they would be talking from 1937 on would have no resonance. The stuff I wanted to talk about, how similar America was then to now, would have the most resonance in 1936, and that's kind of how I landed on that. And you know, and then San Francisco, Chinatown was just for how large that Chinese community was, and also how iconic that was too.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is something very iconic about Chinese, maybe the Chinese American experience or Chinese American locations right before World War II, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and it's coincidental that it's also the beginning of really the beginning of American comics, right? That like comics kind of became a mass medium in America in the 1930s and 40s. For me, like, you know, I feel like the source material led me to that era. So both the Green Turtle was created in the 1940s, and then the Clan of the Fiery Cross was 1946 on the Superman radio show. But after doing some research, I really think that like something flipped for us in the 1940s, right? So for Chinese Americans specifically, before World War II, I think in the 1930s, right, we were, like you portray this in your book, like Chinatown was not where you went for fun, right? That's not where you go to get like cute tchotchkes. It's not where you go to.
It was a different kind of fun. You went to Chinatown for.
Yeah, it's like if you wanted to get mugged, you would go to Chinatown. That's kind of what it was like.
Yeah.
And I think the conception of Chinese Americans was really like we were like genetically prone to crime.
Yeah.
That was the conception.
Yeah.
And then after World War II, the stereotype was we're very loyal and hardworking and trustworthy, right? And really the point at which that flipped, I think, was Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
It was when Pearl Harbor happened, America was like, China is our greatest ally against the Empire of Japan. And all of the stories that we started telling about Chinese were about how we were loyal and hardworking. And I also think that's when like Asian men got emasculated.
Yes,
right?
100%.
Because we were, so after World War II, unlike other communities of color, we were allowed to move into those white neighborhoods with the GI Bill. But it's okay for a Chinese American family to move next door as long as their son doesn't marry your daughter. So super important to make sure that son is not like seen as a sexual being, right? Yeah. So I feel like that there's so much about that period for our history. There's so
Totally.
much of today
Totally,
is
and,
rooted in
and
that.
it's one of the things that, like, and I think you mentioned it sort of like, you mentioned earlier, just like having an opportunity to be part of this discussion, where, you know, the whole history of Asian America, sort of even what Asian American themes, like, that's a conversation we're all kind of still having in public right
Yeah.
now, and so
Yeah.
it's exciting to be putting out work that gets to contribute to that conversation, because it is a really interesting, you know, from the 1930s, tracking from the 1930s to the 1960s, there's a really interesting history of Asian Americans that happened there, specifically Chinese Americans. Because, like you say, in the 1930s, they were demonized. They were, you know, they were thugs and rapists. And then Pearl Harbor happens, and you know, and all of a sudden they're America's allies, and Chinese Americans sort of see like, well, this is our chance, you know. So many Chinese Americans took Japanese Americans sort of took over their stores after they went to internment camps, and you got to see, and there's a really interesting progression in the history of Asian Americans where, like, in the 1950s, they, it's a bit of history that I hadn't known, but one of the things that actually started the model minority myth was, at the time in the 1950s, because of fear of communism, the cops had started like breaking down Chinatown doors again, and apparently it was public relations officials in the San Francisco Chinatown community that said we needed to do something about it. And so they hired a PR firm. And at the time, the big concern in the 1950s was juvenile delinquency. You know, you saw it in Rebel Without a Cause. And they were just like, well, if everyone's scared of these rowdy teenagers, in Chinese culture, we have these strong tiger moms that'll keep their teenagers at bay. And so our boys are loyal. And just even though there was just as much of a history of delinquent Chinese kids as there were delinquent white kids, they started this sort of PR campaign that would eventually help to the formation of the model minority myth. But it was done as self-preservation. It was done as, you know, what do we do to stop people from kicking down our doors? And it becomes this, you know, there's an interesting history and an interesting story that we've allowed ourselves to forget, and that we haven't really told, about just how we went from being demonized to sort of being the model minority.
Great. So I'm going to shift a little bit to some analysis. And so I know in your books there are quite a few instances where there's some triggering scenes. There are some racial slurs used, or some sheer ignorance that is portrayed in many of the works you have. So I just want to know, because it made me uncomfortable. It takes me home to those situations that I've been in, certainly, and so I reflect on that, internalize that, and feel that. But for you, was it difficult to do that, or was it cathartic to do that in your works?
I'll let you go. I answered the first one, so I'll let you go first.
I think it was both for me. I think it was both, especially for Superman Smashes the Klan, because it was targeted at a younger audience. We had real discussions about how far we wanted to go, right? And the thing is, like, the main characters are in junior high, and the ugliest things that I ever heard were in junior high. And, you know, about my ethnicity were in junior high. Typical. But we still wanted to keep it relatively clean. So it was a fine line to ride. But I feel like after we landed and actually wrote those scenes, there was something very cathartic about it.
Yeah. I think there was a lot of catharsis in writing The Good Asian in general, and I feel like it trickled down into a lot of the aspects of it. In terms of the language itself, I don't know if I necessarily found the language cathartic, but one of the things coming off of my last book, Infidel, I realized was Infidel was a book where we tackled race. We tackled race in 2018, which was it's still a very tense time to talk about race. And one of the things that worked out well for that book was that my sort of guiding star was like, I don't know if this is the right thing to talk about, but if it was honest, we'd go there. And anytime we went to honesty unflinchingly, people responded to the book. And so that was sort of my guiding star with this too. It's just kind of like, do I believe that language was used? Absolutely. So what am I doing? Like, who am I talking to if I take that language away? And what conversation does it help? And that became, so the language became more of an aspect of that than me trying to exercise my demons. But having said that, there's a lot of that in the book itself. You know, just in the most recent issue, in issue 5, there's a line where the detective friend tells him that, you know, if we want, this is in Hawaii, if we want Haoles to accept us locals, we have to be undeniable. And I was not expecting how cathartic it was to write that line.
Fantastic. Okay, so when you agreed to be on this panel, I'm just wondering, why did you feel it was important to be part of this panel?
I'm honestly, I'm flattered to be part of the panel. I think, first of all, I think just like, again, having we're at a really interesting time now with entertainment and fiction and talking about Asian American issues, and it's kind of, it's kind of the sort of the great beyond, like, it's all sort of wet cement. So I was really flattered to get a chance to be part of that discussion. And I think if the book's given me anything, it's given me the opportunity to be part of that discussion, but also the chance to, like, and I really can't say this enough, just like, it means so much to see all your faces, to sort of have you guys come out here and do that, just because, especially when I released my book, I didn't know if there was going to be an audience for it. So just to see that there is an audience for it, that whatever it's talking about is resonating in any way whatsoever, I'm just very grateful for the opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. This is really my only in-person event of the year, and it's because it's Eastwind Books. That's really why. I mean, on a cultural level, it's a historic bookstore, but on a personal level, Eastwind Books carried my comics when I used to Xerox them at Copy Central and then hand staple them. They're like one of 2 stores that was willing to let me put my Xerox copy comics on their shelves. So I have to say
Thank you,
yes
Eastwind
when
Books.
they ask. Yeah.
So are we at time, or how are we doing there? One. 2 minutes, okay. Okay, so one quick question then, which I'll ask just about, specifically about the 2 works, Superman and Good Asian. What was the inflection point in your life that got you to this work?
Wow.
Oh, that might not be quick, but we'll go.
Wow. They got us through this work?
To it.
To that
Got
work,
us to it.
I mean, honestly, it was learning about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that happened because of my dad's interest in China and my dad's passing away. So I consider a lot that I probably, if it wasn't for my father, I probably wouldn't have kind of drifted to this material. So yeah, so I owe a lot of it to my dad.
Yeah, I don't know if I have one inflection point. I really think, I think probably for both of us, a lot of our creative work is about trying to figure something out about ourselves.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And I think Superman Smashes the Klan is just part of that.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, no,
As
that makes a lot of sense.
Like an Asian American comic book nerd.
Yeah.
How does my love of comics, how does my love of comics relate to this thing that made me really uncomfortable about myself when I was a kid, my cultural heritage?
And I think too, and I think I can see it in Superman Smash of the Klan, the way you sort of talk about it is like, how does, and also in the Shadow Hero, like, how does, as an Asian American person, how do we fit into this puzzle that is sort of like, American pop culture and superheroes and all these genres that existed before us, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for participating in this panel. It's been a pleasure to have you both here.
Thank you. Thank you, Daren. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
So we're going to move now to the, sorry.
No, we're going to move into audience Q&A. Thank you so much. I have a quick changing of instructions. We were so excited to organize this in person that we miscounted our wireless mics. So we will not have someone running around with a mic in the audience. Instead, I hope it's okay, Daren, that we share your mic with people who have questions. So if you have questions in the audience, please, if you can make your way up to where I'm standing, that would be awesome. We're also waiting for questions from the live stream chat. So also thank you, Rachel, for holding the live stream down for all of our remote viewers. And if they have any questions, she will wave her hands wildly. But yes, proceed.
Please don't be shy. And the only thing I ask is that if you have a question, please end it in a question mark. That's my only rule.
We do have a question from Tuxedo Moon on YouTube Live asking if the Good Asian includes Grant Street in San Francisco.
Includes Grant Street? There are references to Grant Street, absolutely. I don't know if he's looking for specific shout-outs, but there are definitely references to Grant Street.
Oh. Yes.
Is the Good Asian appropriate for kids like me?
That's a question you might need to ask your parents. I write with an R rating. So it depends what your parents sort of say. I like to think we don't go too far, but I do consider an R rating in my head. Yes.
Very good
Sorry.
question. We'll save it for you.
Yeah,
It's not going anywhere.
He could read it first and like censor the
We can also get a cue form, and we're a really polite audience, but please, by all means, you can preemptively start lining up too.
Hey guys, so I draw comics for fun, and I'm trying to work on developing my writing skills. So I was wondering, was it easier or maybe the same to write about your culture or something personal to you, as opposed to like writing a Superman book or something?
I think each has their challenges. I actually think that regardless of what you write, you're going to end up pulling from your own life, right? Even when you're writing about characters that can fly, even when you're writing in like a fantasy world, like in Avatar: Last Airbender, I think writers tend to pull from their own lives. So I think memory research is always going to be there. Yeah, in writing, like you're asking if it was easier. Writing is never easy. Writing is always really hard, right? Writing is so hard.
The one thing I will say is, Dorothy Parker has this line of like, I don't like writing, I like having written. And I used to be like that for a very long time. And it wasn't until I became a professional writer, and like all the business aspects of writing are so horrible, I ended up liking writing more just because in comparison, they're so much more pleasant to deal with than like all the business aspects of writing. Thanks.
Hi guys. I feel like there's a sudden shift kind of in pop culture and Hollywood for just Asian American stories being told. Do you guys feel like there's more opportunities in the comic world now that for these Asian American stories, or do you feel like there's a shift for you guys?
I think there's more opportunity for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've been doing comics for about 20 years as an adult. I think this is the best time for Asian Americans.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons why you're seeing this shift is because the culture is just sort of seeing that Asian Americans know how to spend money, and so and the fact that they've discovered that now means they want, and that they're willing to spend money on stuff that's more targeted to stories that speak directly to them, that's stuff they haven't heard, and so as a result, to the smarter publishers and smarter venues, they're opening up more avenues to sort of get people to tell those stories.
Yeah. And also that like non-Asian audiences can identify with Asian protagonists.
Yeah.
I think there was always a question, is a non-Asian audience going to be accepting of an Asian hero?
Yeah.
And I think it's borne out that the answer is yes.
Yeah. It'll be interesting where we are in like a year or two, because the idea that something like Squid Game could come out and that's a foreign language, most people I know are reading subtitles. Like there was a day where subtitles were the kiss of death, and it's just now that's not the case. It's incredible.
We have another internet question.
From Paul Lai, to both creators, can you talk about the conversations and decisions you have with your artists that might bear on questions of representation? And love your work, by the way.
I'm pretty sure. Do you know this guy? Do you know Paul Lai? I'm pretty sure I know Paul Lai. If it's the same Paul Lai. He writes about comics a lot.
Okay.
He writes for Multiversity.
Oh, okay. Now I feel bad. I probably should know Paul Lai.
I'll introduce you.
Okay, good.
But go ahead.
Oh, no. One of the the conversations that I have, first of all, I love working with Alex so much. He's such a great storyteller. He's such a sensitive person. And a little bit of this was by design. It was really important for the Good Asian to have an artist of Asian descent. And part of that was because the calculation was that there would be conversations we wouldn't need to have. There were certain things that I don't want to micromanage art. I don't know how to describe everything that's in a working class Asian household. Those little details, the little plastic bags that you have to keep the trash when you have a perfectly good trash bag right there. All those little things, I didn't want to have to have all those conversations. And so part of, and Alex has a fantastic story about sort of his own heritage, but he's Vietnamese, and he lived in Vietnam sort of when I talked to him for the book. And one of the things that I've had is that kind of coming in, we prioritize sort of the same things. Like, Edison Hart's masculinity and the fact that he was tough was not a conversation we needed to have. He knew how important that was. It was important to him from the very first illustration. So I think, they say that about enacting, like casting is 80% of the work, and that was the case for me. Just like finding Alex, and again, I think it was because, and he's an adoptee, but we found so many similar things to be important that I didn't need to have those conversations, that I don't think conversations I thought I probably might have to have if he wasn't Asian.
Yeah, we had some conversations on Superman's Match as a Klan. And I think a lot of that is because they're not Japanese American, right? They're Japanese living in Japan, so they just don't have the same history with race that we do. So there's some things that they just like there's an established visual language of racism in America, and there's certain things that have racist connotations, certain drawings that have racist connotations in America that don't necessarily in other cultures. So there are some times when there's a little bit of discussion around that sort of thing. But overall, I think it went really, really well. It was awesome.
Hi, first wanted to thank you both so much for your work. My daughter's in the audience. They're reading American-Born Chinese in school. The question I had is that you've both mentioned the financial challenges of being a comic book artist or writer. And my question is, how do you make ends meet? Is there something else that you do besides doing comics? And also speaking to budding artists out there, any suggestions or advice for people that are thinking about taking on a financially challenging career, but one of passion and heart, such as comics?
Well, Gene, I feel like you know better how the artist question, especially.
Well, I've only been full time at comics for about 5 years. So I've been doing comics for about 20. I was a high school teacher before, and so I was a high school teacher for 17 years. For the second half of that career, I was only part time. So I would be doing comics at home half the time, and then teaching high school half the time. It is tough. I think it is tough. I'm a big fan of the side hustle, to be honest. Like, I'm a big fan of, you find something that you can use, that you enjoy, that you can use to feed yourself, that will also give you enough time and energy to do your comic, to do whatever creative pursuit you have on the side. That's my advice.
I mean, I still consider myself, I'm lucky enough to consider writing a full-time profession, but I consider my day job to be writing TV, and then on my side projects are my comics, where it gets to be a lot more personal, and I get to scratch all the itches that I want. And so yeah, and the one thing I will say, though, is that if you're going to be in comics, and being an artist is definitely the way to go. It's a lot harder if you're a writer. So the fact that, that your daughter is drawing, that she's writing, I mean, that's a fantastic path to go to, and makes a hard job at least somewhat easier in that sense. No problem.
I think we have, including the internet question, 3 more people. So we'll call it after the last person in line here, and then I'll hand the mic back to you, Daren.
Hi. You kind of answered this already, but I was wondering if you grapple between how your work is viewed with Asian Americans versus Asians in Asia. Like you're talking about working with Guri Huru or Pornsak, your parents are Thai. Like, there's a lot of things coded, like you said, for us that may not be interpreted the same way in Asia. And thank you for coming here.
So could I get if anyone heard that question, could
I think you're asking about the difference between Asian Americans and Asians, right, in comics.
Or how readers would.
And readers.
Yeah.
Yeah, Asian American and Asian readers.
Yeah, it's interesting, because for me, one of the things I'm specifically looking at when I'm thinking about writing is that my audience is sort of Asian American. I'm writing specifically for that audience, and in a way, everyone else who enjoys it is kind of a bonus to me, even down to the title, like something like The Good Asian. Asian Americans get that title instantly. But if you're not Asian American, I've heard a lot of like, do we like this title? Are we cool with this title? And then usually an Asian American comes in, it's like, no, we're cool and this is why. But I've heard it so many times. It's like, are we okay with this title? But I like that it's speaking directly to Asian Americans, because I do think too that like one of the mistakes that, and we're slowly watching them course correct, but one of the mistakes entertainment and Hollywood specifically is making is conflating Asia with Asian American, and they're two such drastically different groups. And so they'll say like, oh, well, we're writing something for the Asian audience. We don't understand why these Asian Americans aren't liking it. And it's just like, well, for the same reason why if you write something for Nigeria, like someone in Harlem might not be digging it. So for me, this book specifically, I'm writing specifically for Asian American audiences, and everyone else and hopefully I'm doing a good enough job that the stuff is accessible and universal enough that you don't need to be part of that group to enjoy it. But hopefully, there are nuances in there that you will specifically lean into because you're Asian American. That's how I look at my book anyway.
Yeah, I think I come from a very similar vantage point. There's just no way I can write from a perspective that's not Asian American, right? I lived an Asian American life, and it'll just come through. So I did a book for DC Comics called New Superman, which is about the Superman of China, a kid in Shanghai, 17-year-old kid in Shanghai inherits some of Clark Kent's powers and becomes the Superman of China. The entire story is set in China. I have never lived in China. I've only visited. And at first I was very reluctant to do that book because I just thought I can't escape my own Asian Americanness, Ultimately I didn't, and it was a lot of fun. But I did hear from readers in China who said, this reads like somebody who lives in America wrote it. And I was like, yep.
We have a question from Guy Robert. How do they feel about DC and Marvel being owned by large media conglomerates, and if that affects the benefits they mentioned about lack of money in comics being a blessing in some ways?
I mean, I don't know if I have any feelings as much as I guess that's the way it is, and you just kind of have to deal with it. I mean, I think there's a very big conversation happening now in the comics community about, stuff based on comic books makes a ton of money, and that money doesn't necessarily trickle back to the people who create the comic books. And it's we're used to seeing that conversation, but usually, it sparks up like a wildfire and then goes out. And the fact that it's been happening for a while now and seems to be picking up steam, it seems to be a conversation that seems to be echoing a little bit. I'll be curious to see if that changes anything, because, I mean, it's exactly right. They're making millions and billions of dollars off this material, and the comic book creators who started it, they're not even getting credited for the, forget money, they're not even getting credited for like their contributions to the final product. So hopefully there's a little bit of change in that.
Yeah. I mean, there is a benefit to telling stories within a shared universe, right? Like Shang-Chi, if Shang-Chi were just an independent movie apart from the Marvel universe, the discussion that we've had for the last month and a half wouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
Or at least it wouldn't have been as loud,
Yeah.
right? It wouldn't have been as loud, and it wouldn't have been as sustained. But I think what you point to is right. It's historically, American comics have not treated their creators very well. And I do think that's changing. I actually think there's a lot of pressures on Marvel and DC to change now.
Yeah.
So like Image, the publishers of Good Asian, they're largely they're a creator empowering company, right? You own everything
Yeah.
that you do for them.
Yeah.
So I think as Image gets more and more hits, like they have been, I think it puts pressure on Marvel and DC. And the other thing that puts pressure on Marvel and DC is the fact that I think the largest part of the American comic book industry right now is the middle grade and YA segment. Like Raina Telgemeier and Dave Pilkey, they outsell Batman and Superman by miles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, 100%.
Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me properly? Okay, cool. Thank you, first of all, for having this talk. It's been really enlightening. My question is largely based on, kind of inspired by the conversation you said earlier about how the community is pretty small, but you're also like coming from a space where like your identity as an Asian Americans is very like salient to your writing and your art. So, as someone who is in the periphery of this and wants to like lean into it, I also have noticed that like in some ways it's a very inaccessible field to get into, especially as someone who has multiple identities that just do not fit within the quote unquote conventional reader or writer, creator of comics. So I don't know if you've noticed how accessible it is for, it seems to me like it's not a very welcome space for women, for like gender minorities, like people of different sexual orientations, so how, for people who have these, and like I'm assuming it was not always that easy for you to enter these spaces as well. I don't really have a direct question for it, just more like how do you navigate this? Do you see people with multiple, like intersecting identities, like how do they actually build a space for themselves that, where people actually want to read their stuff?
It's funny. We had a conversation that overlaps with this sort of in the green room, before coming out, and that was a longer conversation. So I'll try to summarize it quickly. But one of the part of that conversation was that the comic book community is, to your point, a straight white, usually male sort of community, and it does sort of feel like women and people of color, they're starting to get opportunities at bat right now, but they get one chance, that a white creator might get 2 or 3 chances before someone decides to give up on them. But if you're white, if you're, if you're LGBTQ, if you're a person of color, you get one, and if you don't hit it out of the park, they kind of move on to sort of the next person. So it is challenging. One of the things that I will say, and I was just mentioning them earlier, I look at someone like Vida Ayala as sort of inspirational, black, queer, female, and the huge writer, a huge enormous amount of success. One of the things that definitely makes it easier in comics is if you draw as well, if you're an artist, because that way you can create those opportunities. As purely a writer, then you need to hire an artist, and then you need to make relationships with an artist, and you're going to need to spend money on art, and that is tricky. The one sort of advice that I can give you is, at least from what I'm seeing now, and I don't think this is an answer, but it does seem like it might be evolving into an answer, is the fact that on Twitter, on Instagram, there are these huge communities now and finding your space within that can help amplify your voice. It can help, and from what I don't know Vida very well, but it's looking at their career from afar. It seems to be that's some of the things that they did was finding that community, championing other people in that community. Ultimately helps you sort of bring up your own stuff. And then the other aspect to that is being a friend and being a champion of artists. I think one of the big mistakes that people trying to break into comics make is they say, well, how do I get started in comics? How do I make a comic? And a lot of times what they're actually asking, what they don't realize they're asking is, how do I get an artist to work on my comic for free? And I think it's realizing that's what it's very easy to get your first break in comics. You find an artist and you pay them their going rate. The problem is, well, most of the time, most of us can't afford their going rate. And then it becomes, well, how do I become part of this community of artists? And I do think that for the people who stick around in comics, and that's one of the reasons why I say it's a lovely community, the people are there because they love the community and love the art form as much as it's due. So if you can find that community for yourself, I don't think it's going to answer all your questions, but I think it'll be the first couple steps to answering that question.
Yeah, I think it depends on what you mean by accessible, right? So if you mean getting a gig with like the big two, with Marvel or DC, it is very difficult. And up until very recently, it was like a straight white guy's game. But if you're talking about just entering comics, it's like one of the most accessible media in America right now. Because really all you need to do is you need to write it, you need to draw it, you need to Xerox it at Copy Central, and then you need to get a store like Eastwind to carry it. That's honestly, that's how I got started. That's how I got in. And there are conventions too where you pay a couple $100s for a table and then you sell it. And you're not going to sell a lot. You're going to sell like maybe a dozen copies on a good weekend. But you're in. That's what it takes to get in, right? So if you don't draw, I do think it's trickier. But it's not insurmountable. I think there are lots of solutions now, lots of digital solutions now that you can use, right? Like there are comics now that are built from screenshots from video games. There are just lots of ways of doing it. And the thing about comics is there's no rules. So as long as you make it and you can get it on the shelves of a store like Eastwind, that's it, you're in.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. This has been a great conversation, and we appreciate you being here. Please give it up for Gene and Pornsak.
Thank you once more. Thank you so much, Gene and Pornsak, for being part of the first large-scale in-person gathering at OACC in a very long time. And thank you, Daren, for being open and down to facilitate. This was a wonderful program. Just some logistical things. As an OACC staff, I have 2 things that I would love to relate to you. If you enjoyed today's event and or have suggestions for how we can improve the audience experience, either virtual, if you're joining from online, or in person, we have paper surveys here, as well as an online survey link that will be in the YouTube chat. We would love to hear from you, your feedback on how this was. Another thing that's coming up is OACC is celebrating 25 years operating out of this facility. We are doing a virtual gala this Friday, October 15th. Our live silent auction is already going on, and we do have some comic-specific goodies out there, courtesy of Cape and Cal Comics. Thank you so much. And Daren, also, thank you for helping us get some of those goodies. So please check that out. And otherwise, I want to wish you all a wonderful, beautiful afternoon. Thank you all for coming.